We start our course with the first stage, which is developing raw files. The files captured by the camera that contain all the information captured while taking the photo. This includes information about shadows, highlights, colors, details, and more. For this purpose, we use one of several available software specifically designed for developing raw files. My choice is definitely Capture One. It also seems to be kind of industry standard at the moment, mainly because the photos are already well saturated with beautifully rendered colors and nice contrast. Whereas in programs like Lightroom or Camera Raw from Photoshop, the photos are slightly faded and more subdued from the beginning. Hence this choice, but the developing tools in all these programs will be very similar. So all the information I provide here can be applied to other programs you have on your computer. The goal of this stage is essentially to extract all the necessary details and specifics that will be needed for working on this photo in Photoshop. We will address overly dark shadows, such as in the area of the hair, where some details have been lost in the shadow. Sometimes the photo is overexposed with overly strong highlights, so we can also recover those highlights at this initial stage. I don't really perform complicated edits or selective changes here. Instead, I set the global settings of the photo to establish a good foundation for further work in Photoshop. I aim to direct the photo towards a neutral state in terms of colors and temperature to have all the necessary details for further editing. I will also show you the main panels I use for developing photos at this stage. There won't be many, it will be just the exposure panel, where we adjust brightness, contrast, saturation. These are all global settings. We work with the temperature of the photo, which is the white balance, determining whether the photo leans towards cool or warm tones. In the HDR panel, which deals with high dynamic range, we work on recovering highlights if needed, brightening shadows, and extracting information from them. Sometimes there may be a need to work on colors at this stage, but I think we won't be doing that for this particular photo. There are some redness on the skin, as you can see, but we can easily address that in Photoshop, where it's more convenient to select specific elements of the photo and edit them. It is possible at this stage, but I believe it's not necessary. We are primarily establishing a base, and any selective edits will be done in Photoshop. The first step in our work on the photo will be to address its brightness, contrast, and saturation using the exposure panel in Capture One. I like to work on a copy of the photos to easily compare it with the original. And in Capture One you can clone a variant by right-clicking, and that's what we'll be working on. So, looking at this photo, it seems slightly too dark to me. I want it to be more fresh, bright and vibrant, so we'll tackle that first. We can always check what the program thinks about the exposure of the photo by clicking on this magical wand here, which will set the exposure values the program considers appropriate. Let's see how it looks. In my opinion, it's overexposed. The photo has become too bright, overexposed, so we'll decrease the exposure visually until we are satisfied. I think around 0.6 is great in this case. No highlights are blown out and the shadows have opened up a bit, making the entire photo more vibrant. At this stage, I also often add a slight contrast, but it's important to make subtle changes. Going into high contrast ranges can ruin the photo, blowing out the highlights and making the shadows too dark. We don't want that. we want the photo to have a neutral base. So I would make it around 8 or 9. It gives the photo a bit more 3D look without blowing out anything or drowning anything in black. In Capture One, we can always check the state before our edits. There's an icon for that. By holding the Alt key, you will see the keys I press displayed in the bottom left corner. We click that icon and see the original state. It was dark and now it's a bit brighter. Everything has opened up a bit. I don't usually touch the brightness slider. It's just a global adjustment for lightening or darkening the photo. So we can reset it with a double click. In portraits, where there is a lot of skin, it's often worth reducing the saturation slightly. The skin starts to look more elegant and not so overly colorful. Again, subtle adjustments are enough. I think around -6 is great. Let's check before and after. The original was a bit hazy and dark, and now it's more open, but nothing is overexposed. It's a good base, so we'll finish working with this panel at this stage. The next step is to adjust the white balance of the photo, which is essentially the temperature. It determines whether the photo appears warmer or cooler. We have two sliders for that, representing the degrees of Kelvin, indicating whether the photo is cooler or warmer. And then there's the tint slider, which allows us to add a touch of magenta to warm up the photo, or cyan and green to cool it down. Here it's also worth checking the auto setting, which shows us how the program sees the photo and how it would set the white balance towards the neutral setting, which is what the auto mode aims for. We click on the magic wand and see that it has shifted it slightly towards the cooler side. Let's check the before. We had a fairly warm photo and the auto setting has directed us towards a cooler bluish tone, but based on a visual assessment it seems a bit too cool for our case. We would like the photo to have a bit of warmth so that the skin looks natural. It's also a good idea to change the gray background to white. Often on a dark background we are not entirely sure which direction the photo is leaning towards. And sometimes it's useful to compare it against white. We can clearly see it on white. Here we are slightly on the cooler side, so we will visually adjust it slightly towards warmth. To the right, around 5100 Kelvin, which I like the most. I think the tint is fine at this level. Let's check our edits before and after these adjustments. The photo is more neutral, providing a good base for further work. We'll finish here and move on to working with the high dynamic range. In the next step, we will work on recovering some details from the shadows in the hair, which appear as a dark area where it's difficult to distinguish individual strands. It might not be necessary for all the hairs to be perfectly visible, but we can recover some details and information from the shadows. For this we will use the HDR panel, specifically the shadow slider. So we simply move the shadow slider to the right, allowing more details to emerge from the shadows. Again, these are very subtle adjustments. We usually avoid making drastic shifts, unless there is a real need, such as when the photo is severely underexposed. In this case, where the photo is evenly lit, we can gently recover some details from the shadows. Let's see how it was and how it looks now. I think it's okay. There is also a blacks slider, which selectively retrieves a bit more information from the darkest points. And I think this level is fine. Let's take a look at the before and after again. In the same panel, we could work on the highlights if they were heavily overexposed. By using the highlights slider, We would move it to the left to recover some information from the brightest parts of the photo. Let's see how it looks in this case. We have gained some details in the skin, but in this particular photo I don't think it's necessary because it flattens the image a bit when the highlights are toned down. So I wouldn't touch this slider, especially since there are no overexposed areas. There are details, everything looks fine, and the photo has a three-dimensional quality to it. We'll leave it at this level and we are done. As I mentioned at the beginning, sometimes there is a need to edit the colors of specific elements in the photo during the raw development stage. This includes correcting color differences in the skin tone, among other things. In this particular example, it seems that these differences can be addressed in Photoshop because they are pretty minor. We have a slightly reddish forehead and nose compared to the rest of the body, but we can easily address that in Photoshop by easily selecting those areas. We'll show you how to do it later. However, sometimes there are such drastic color differences that it's worth addressing them at this stage. An example is this photo, where the skin on the face and neck appears very yellow and orange, while the skin on the fingers is significantly red. So in this example I will show you how the color editing panel in Capture One works. It's located here. It has three tabs. The basic tab, where you can edit individual colors, and the advanced tab, where you can use the eyedropper tool to select specific color ranges and edit them. You can add multiple ranges as well. In our example, let's start with the skin color on the face and neck. Using the eyedropper tool, we select an area of the yellowish skin, the most intense yellow. It will be somewhere on the neck. Here we see the highlighted color we clicked on. It's quite yellow, and on the color wheel there's a wider range that Capture One has marked for editing. This range includes both yellow and red. And since we only want to edit the yellow color, we need to reduce the size of this range to focus only on the color we are interested in. To do that, we can display only the selected range, and everything else that won't be editable will appear grayed out. In this case, the lips and the shirt have been grayed out a bit. But the fingers still fall within the range of our edit, and we don't want to edit the fingers at this moment because we want to focus on the yellow skin on the face, which we want to shift towards red. If we had the fingers included, they would become even more red, and we don't want that. So we remove the red area that we have here on the color wheel, ensuring that we only edit the skin on the face and neck. We have now highlighted what we are editing, and we can see it clearly on the image. I hope this is clear. Now, only the yellow color, the one we want to work on, is highlighted. We can uncheck the preview to see the entire photo, and now we can use the hue slider to shift the yellow color towards red, which means moving it to the left. By doing so, the yellow color on the face gets closer to the red color. Of course, we don't want to make it exactly red because we don't like that either, but we want to bring it closer, so we will stop here. In the second step, using the same eyedropper tool, we select the red color that we want to shift towards yellow. We click on it and we highlight the range we have selected to make it easier for us to narrow it down. We see that it also includes the skin color on the face and neck, and again we want to remove it from our editing range. We can see that the yellow color falls somewhere here, so we reduce our range to focus only on the red color on the fingers. The lips also fall within the range, but that's fine in this case. Okay, yellow is deselected and only red remains. We uncheck the preview, and again, using the hue slider, this time we move it towards the yellow side, which means to the right, so that we bring the color of the fingers closer to the color on the face. I think this level of adjustment will make our work easier in Photoshop later on. At this stage, it's not about matching the colors perfectly, but rather bringing them closer together so that it will be easier to fine-tune the color of the fingers and the skin in Photoshop. Capture One has a great tool for selecting individual colors, as you've seen, and these ranges are very convenient to edit, and you can see what you can select and edit. That's why I would use this panel in Capture One in such cases. Let's check how it was before. We had a significant difference between the skin on the face and the fingers, and now after, where the colors are much closer to each other. So this is how I would use the color editing panel in Capture One. Okay, let's recap on what we have done, because we are essentially ready to develop our main photo. Let's just assess if we have completed everything and if we are satisfied, and I will show you how to develop this photo into a Photoshop file. The photo is much brighter than the original. We have expanded all the ranges, nothing got overexposed in the process. We brought out some details from the shadows and we adjusted the temperature of the photo. We started with a warm-toned photo and went for cooler tones, but the skin still looks vibrant and warm, which is exactly what we want. So now we will develop it into a Photoshop file. In Capture One, this is done in the Export Recipes tab, and we will want to develop it into a PSD file. If you don't have such a recipe, we can create one. Click on the plus sign, give the recipe a name, for example PSD course, and specify the file format you want to develop the photos into. Choose PSD, which is the Photoshop file format. Leave the color profile as Adobe RGB, as it is the only correct choice at this point. Keep the resolution at 300 pixels per inch. Leave it at 100% if you want to develop the photo in its full dimension. Finally, add the destination folder for the developed photo, and that's it. Click Process, and we have the developed photo. So we will soon start working on this photo in Photoshop.